All right, hello, here we go. These are our review videos to prepare us for the first quiz for Unit 4. I wanted to just start on slide 93 because these are all the fair game key terms. Bear with me while these slides finish loading. Just occurred to me that on the homework calendar, it currently says the key terms are on slide 91. I must have edited something somewhere, so they're now on slide 83. I will make that update on the calendar, but it may take a moment for the calendar to embed properly. Let's rewind, shall we? Actually, I'm going to rewind this way. Bear in mind, for those of you out there who are watching this who I don't teach, one of the things that we did throughout the sections of GS2 history is to provide a disclaimer. This is probably one of the most controversial units that we do in this course. And for those of you outside of our school, I am trying everything I can to use language that is considering multiple perspectives. If you have a strong opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the greater Arab-Israeli conflict, just bear in mind, right, we are trying to go about this with an open mind and broad perspectives. All right, without further ado, let's talk about the content that we need to know. So I'm going to really quickly skip through all these sort of general identity activities, and let's just start talking about the beginning of Zionism, because that's our first major key term, right? So the context, right? These were just some activities that we did. Remember, if you wanted to go back to this, there are slides that you did as a class, right? Basically, one of the first activities we did in class was to look at the broader history of anti-Semitism, right? One of the purposes of this activity was to think about how anti-Semitism was by no means something that was unique to the Holocaust, right? I actually am going to click on, let's just go with the A period slides, right? So you can see just a little bit, but I'm not going to go through your content. But if you remember, we looked at anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire, right? We looked at anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire, most specifically the creation of the Pale of Settlement during the reign of Catherine the Great. I'm just going to quickly scroll through these slides, but you can look at them on your own. A couple of them are key terms, but I would not ask for a lot of excruciating detail. What I would really expect for you guys to know is, what does this say about anti-Semitism broadly, right? And how can we use this to understand the growth of Zionism once we get to the beginning of the 20th century? So the general theme of all these slides, forgive me, they are taking really long to load, is that there are a number of periods in history where Jews were blamed for certain things, right? The Black Death is a really good example of this, right? Where Jews were forcibly removed from the lands that they were living in, you know, dating back to the Roman Empire. The Reconquista is also a really interesting event. The Pale of Settlement, right? This area that was sort of designated for the Jewish population in the Russian Empire to live in, right? And then, of course, the publication of the very anti Semitic Protocol of the Elders of Zion in the early 20th century. Remember that the first language it was published in was English, which is interesting because, yes, the American public read this book because anti Semitism was certainly a thing in the United States at this period. Right, the Dreyfus Affair, right? Largely, one could argue that Alfred Dreyfus was solely convicted because of his religion. And this shows us how prominent anti Semitism was in Europe as well. And it really is around this time, the turn of the 20th century, that Zionism is born. So without further ado, let's talk about that some more. You could look more at your own individual slides if you choose, but that's really the level of detail that we would want to get into for those terms. All right, so Zionism, right? Broadly, we are talking about, right, a movement that had been forming far before this, but that really materialized at the turn of the 20th century, right around the period before World War I. And what Zionists wanted was a Jewish state, right? In the earliest formulations of Zionism as a belief, it was not, 100% certain where the state would be, although Zionists wanted it to be in their Holy Land, right? They wanted it to be somewhere surrounding their holy city of Jerusalem, right? But at this period, right, it was not 100% sure where it was going to be, right? In fact, when Theodor Herzl was writing The Jewish State, this was before the British Mandate of Palestine was even formed, right? This was still part of the Ottoman Empire. So I did not include Pinsker on the key terms list, but realize I put Pinsker on here partially because Herzl, even though he's one of the most famous Zionists, right, and one of the most famous early Zionists, that is, Pinsker actually wrote some of his ideas before that, right? And in general, I would argue that Pinsker is sort of more of the theoretical Zionist, right? This is why a Jewish state is so important, right? Or rather, this is why, you know, essentially Jews need to sort of liberate themselves, right? They cannot rely on others to do so, right? And that is because of anti Semitism, right? But then what Herzl does is he actually develops more of a tangible plan for what Zionists can do to achieve their goal of establishing a Jewish state, right? But again, even Herzl, even though Herzl wanted Israel to form, right, in what was Palestine after World War One, he is not 100% committed to that idea, right? Sorry that I'm a little bit vague on that. He does really want it to be there, but he was open to some other options, right? One important thing for us to be aware of is that the Zionist movement could be considered an example of nationalism or the quest for a nation state. And the reason why that was because there was no Jewish state, right? And this is a period when these new states are forming, right? So, a perfect example, right? The former Austro Hungarian Empire, right? You see these new states that are created after World War One. I know that Yugoslavia no longer exists, but that's a very prominent example of a new state that was carved out after World War One, right? But what you're seeing is that there's a very substantial Jewish population throughout Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. The former Pale of Settlement is very interesting here, right? But they don't have a country that is majority Jewish. They do not have a country where they truly feel like they are the majority, where they are actually governing themselves. So they sort of feel like they are continued victims of anti Semitism and they want to do something about that, right? And this sentiment is only going to grow as the 19th century comes to an end. And part of that is because of these new nation states forming. One interesting example is that Greece becomes independent in 1831 from the Ottomans, right? Italy unifies in 1871, I want to say, or 1870. I may be mixing that up with Germany, which also unifies right at the same time, right? And all these unifications of states actually contributes to nationalism as a whole, which is one of the major causes of World War One. So Zionists essentially want the same thing. They say, well, we too want a nation state, right? And one of the major reasons why they wanted that was because they were spread out, right? They were in a diasporic sort of not not community singular. Jews were, right, all spread out throughout not only Europe, but the Middle East, right? And the entire world, right, by this time, right? But there was not a state in the world where they felt safe from anti-Semitism, right? And what's really interesting, actually, is that in the 19th century, you're going to see some European countries actually pass legislation and adopt policies that were seen as more friendly to Jewish people, right? There were actually some countries prior to this that had laws that were almost like a watered down version of Hitler's Nuremberg laws, right? Laws that were restricting where Jews could live, what kind of jobs they could have, uh, what kind of property they could own, if any, who they could marry, right? Now, many Western European states actually eased up on a lot of these restrictions in the 19th century. So, what this allowed for was for Jews to be able to pursue new career opportunities, right? To live where they choose, right? Um, and what's interesting about this is that this actually contributes to a growth in anti Semitism. So one might ask, hold up, how come more tolerant laws in Europe could contribute to a growth in anti Semitism? Well, the answer is actually more straightforward than you might think. But I want to preface this slide by saying that this is what anti Semites believed. This is not reality, okay? Because the way this slide is written might make some people really pause. I want it to be very clear that these are anti Semitic beliefs, okay? Right? So here are the fears, right? As Jews enjoy some of the same equal rights as their non Jewish counterparts in Europe, increasingly the non-Jewish population is scared, right, that they are losing their jobs, right? They are scared that Jews are sort of overrepresenting certain career fields like medicine, finance, film, etc., right? Again, this is not necessarily reality, this is the fear. And a lot of this fear manifested itself in the publication of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, one of the most anti Semitic books that was published in the turn of the 20th century, right? Like I said earlier, this book was originally published in English, and it was translated into many languages subsequently, right? And I included one picture of one of the covers of the book to just show you how anti Semitic even the cover art could be, right? Looking at this sort of grossly exaggerated face, right? Portrayed in the form of a snake covered in the Star of David. One of the biggest fears that the authors of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion articulated was the idea that there was a conspiracy theory in the Jewish population to take over the world, right? So when this book circulated, what you're going to see is that there's going to be a wave of anti Semitic acts, right? Even if the laws in certain European countries remained tolerant, individuals, citizens, not necessarily, right? You're going to see a rise in discrimination against Jews living in Europe and the United States for that matter. General prejudice, and also the increase of pogroms, which did happen in Russia in the Pale of Settlement. But pogroms are essentially massacres, right? Some of them occur somewhat sporadically, but others are quite organized and calculated. One of the most prominent examples of one of those very organized and massive pogroms was Kristallnacht, probably the most famous, shortly before World War II started, right? Virtually all of these pogroms happened on the same night, right? A complete just devastation of Jewish property, synagogues, businesses, etc., which of course launched terror in the Jewish community, right? Um, okay, cool. So I think that I want to keep these videos rather short, but I wanted to include this chart. In fact, this chart finds itself on a number of our slides to give you a sense of what some of the effects of the growth of anti-Semitism in Europe are going to be. One of the most important ones is that as Zionism grows, right, there's going to be more attention paid toward the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding land, right, the land that will become the state of Israel. Again, I think that reason for that is pretty straightforward, right? They don't feel safe living in Europe anymore, so they want to move elsewhere. So where we are right now on this timeline is just right around here. So the population of Jews in in what will become Israel, right, is rather small compared to the overall population. But we're going to look at what's going to happen as this population increases rather quickly, how that will contribute to a lot of violence and tension in what will become the British Mandate of Palestine. So let's take a break and do a new video in a moment. Stay tuned and thanks.